In the heart of the Arctic Circle lay a forgotten village untouched by modernity, its name long erased from maps. Winter reigned eternal here, a freezing prison where the sun hid for months at a time. The residents called it the month of givings, a period where survival depended on unity, or so they said. Elizabeth and her family had moved to the town just before December, drawn by the promise of cheap land and work opportunities her husband, Jack, had found online. The locals were welcoming at first, showering them with gifts of homemade bread, carved trinkets, and jars of preserved food. "Father Frost bless you this season," the mayor, a wiry man named Magnus, said, as he handed Jack a basket brimming with wine bottles. "We're glad to have fresh faces, but remember, community is everything here." Elizabeth didn't think much of the warning. She was more focused on settling her children, Lucy, 7, and Daniel, 5, into their new lives. The nights were long, the winds howling like banshees against the thin walls of their new home, but the family adapted quickly. That was, until the first gift arrived. It came in a plain wooden box, left at their doorstep on December 15th. Inside, wrapped in crimson-stained burlap, was the head of a fox. Its mouth was frozen in a grotesque snarl, and its milky eyes seemed to follow Elizabeth as she recoiled in horror. A note was attached, written in spidery handwriting. "One must always give to Father Frost." Elizabeth showed it to Jack, who dismissed it as a macabre prank. "Small-town hazing," he said, tossing the box into the trash. "We're outsiders, they're testing us." But Elizabeth couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. The gifts kept coming. The next was a jar of teeth, yellowed and cracked, unmistakably human. Then came a bundle of tiny frozen fingers. Jack tried to reassure her, insisting it was just a sick joke, but his bravado cracked when Lucy woke up screaming one night, claiming she'd seen a man watching her through the frosted window. "He was so big, Mommy," Lucy whispered, trembling in her mother's arms. "His face was all wrong, like it melted." Elizabeth felt her heart drop. She checked every window and door, but there was no sign of anyone outside, only the endless white expanse of snow under a pale moon. By Christmas Eve, the town's sinister traditions became impossible to ignore. Magnus invited the family to a grand feast in the town hall, where every villager gathered. The hall was adorned with strange decorations, wreaths made of animal bones, candles dripping with what looked like blood, and a massive ice sculpture of a figure that resembled both Santa Claus and a demon. Its grin stretched too wide, and its hands held chains instead of gifts. "Who's that supposed to be?" Jack asked uneasily. Magnus chuckled, his teeth gleaming like a wolf's. "Father Frost, he protects us from the eternal winter. We thank him by offering a gift each year." Elizabeth's stomach churned. "What kind of gift?" Magnus raised his glass, ignoring the question. "To the month of giving. May our offerings keep us safe." The villagers cheered, their voices blending into an unsettling cacophony. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. As the clock struck midnight, she heard faint whispers outside. She peeked through the curtains and saw figures in the distance, hooded and carrying lanterns, marching toward the town square. Curiosity overcame her. She bundled herself in a coat and crept outside, careful not to wake Jack or the kids. She followed the procession, her breath clouding in the frigid air. The villagers gathered in a circle around a single figure, a young woman bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Magnus stood at the center, holding a ceremonial dagger. "We give so that we may live," he declared, plunging the blade into the woman's chest. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold. The villagers chanted as the woman's lifeless body was dragged to a large crack in the ice and thrown into the abyss. Elizabeth stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. She fled to her home, her mind racing. On Christmas morning, Magnus knocked on their door. His smile was cheerful, but his eyes were cold. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Elizabeth clutched her children protectively. Jack stood between them and Magnus, his fists clenched. "We know you saw the ceremony last night," Magnus said casually, as if discussing the weather. "It's important you understand. This is how we survive. The creature beneath the ice, Father Frost, is real. If we don't feed it, it will come for us all." "This is insane," Jack spat. "We're leaving." Magnus shook his head. "You can't. The storm won't let you, and if you try, Father Frost will ensure you never make it past the woods." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. "What do you want from us?" Magnus smiled that wolfish grin again. "You're new here, Elizabeth. Every new family must participate. This year we've chosen you as the offering." The week leading up to New Year's Eve was a nightmare. The family tried to flee, but every road out of town was blocked by snowdrifts. Their attempts to call for help were met with static. Meanwhile, the villagers became increasingly hostile, leaving warnings on their doorstep. Butchered animals, blood-smeared messages that read, "Run and you'll die screaming." Elizabeth noticed Lucy whispering to someone who wasn't there. When pressed, the girl admitted she'd been talking to Father Frost. "He's so sad, Mommy," Lucy said. "He doesn't like the gifts they give him. He wants something real." On New Year's Eve, the family made one last desperate attempt to escape. They packed their car and drove through the blizzard, but after hours of driving, they found themselves back at the town square. It was as if the storm had herded them back. The villagers were waiting, torches in hand. Magnus ordered the family out of the car, and when Jack resisted, they dragged him out and beat him unconscious. Elizabeth and her children were forced to the town square, where the ice sculpture of Father Frost loomed larger than ever. "This is the way it must be," Magnus intoned. "Elizabeth will appease him, and you'll be free to live here in peace." "No!" Elizabeth screamed as they bound her hands and feet. Lucy cried, clinging to her mother, but a villager tore her away. Magnus raised the dagger. But before he could strike, the ice beneath the sculpture cracked with a deafening roar. A freezing wind howled as a monstrous figure emerged, a towering amalgamation of skeletal remains, animalistic claws, and a face that melted and reformed like molten wax. Its eyes burned like embers, and its chains rattled with every step. The villagers screamed, but there was nowhere to run. Father Frost tore through them, ripping limbs from bodies and dragging their writhing forms into the abyss beneath the ice. Blood painted the snow crimson as Elizabeth struggled against her bonds. The creature stopped before her, its fiery eyes boring into hers. It leaned down, and in a voice like grinding ice it spoke. "They lied to you. I never asked for gifts. I asked for justice." The chains that bound it snapped, and the creature turned its wrath on the town. Buildings were crushed under its weight, and the villagers' screams echoed into the night as they were consumed. By dawn, the village was no more, just a smoldering ruin buried in snow. Elizabeth, Jack, and the children were the only survivors. As they fled the desolate landscape, Lucy turned to her mother and whispered, "He says thank you. He'll rest now." Elizabeth didn't respond. She didn't dare look back. The legend of the 13th month would die with that cursed village, but the memory of Father Frost's vengeance would haunt Elizabeth forever. Liz had always adored Mike. From the moment they met, her love grew with an intensity that startled her. Every glance, every word he spoke, every smile she caught on his face made her heart race. In the beginning, it was a beautiful feeling, a kind of romance that she thought only existed in the movies. But soon, that love twisted into something else, something deeper, darker, and more obsessive. It started small, almost harmless. She would find herself staring at him as he worked, her eyes tracing the curve of his jaw or the way his fingers moved over his laptop keyboard. At night, she'd wake up, not out of discomfort or restlessness, but simply to watch him breathe. The rhythmic rise and fall of his chest comforted her, reassured her that he was there with her always. It was innocent at first, but as time passed, Liz couldn't stop watching. It became her every waking thought, an itch in her brain that she couldn't scratch. She didn't want to lose a single second of him. Every moment of his life became hers to observe, catalog, consume. Mike began to notice. At first he brushed it off. He was married to Liz after all. Couples do weird things sometimes. But then her presence began to feel smothering. He would wake up to find her sitting at the foot of the bed, staring at him, unblinking. She started taking days off work to be home with him. He would come out of the shower and she would be standing in the doorway, eyes wide, fingers tapping against her thigh. When he asked her about it, she laughed it off, said she just couldn't get enough of him. She was always there, watching. Days turned into weeks, and Liz's obsession deepened. She followed Mike to work, sitting across the street in her car, her eyes glued to the office windows. She knew the exact time he went for lunch, the minute he left for meetings, and when he was back at his desk. Her love had transformed into a grotesque kind of surveillance, and no matter how much she tried to justify it in her mind, she knew something was wrong. But the thought of stopping filled her with panic. What if he left? What if he disappeared from her life? Mike couldn't handle it anymore. Her gaze was everywhere. It felt like spiders crawling across his skin, eyes boring into his back. He couldn't focus, couldn't sleep. Every time he opened his eyes, there she was, staring, always watching, never speaking. The house felt smaller, claustrophobic. He started spending more time at work just to escape her gaze. But Liz was relentless. One night, after weeks of enduring her creepy, unyielding attention, Mike snapped. Liz had been sitting in the corner of the room for hours, her face expressionless, but her eyes alive with intensity. He asked her, begged her to stop, to give him some space. She just smiled, that sick, saccharine smile that made his stomach turn, and said, "I just love you, Mike. I can't look away." That night, something inside Mike broke. Exhausted, mentally frayed, he went to bed, his mind swirling in a fog of resentment, fear, and anger. As he slept, he began to dream. Vivid, violent dreams of Liz, her eyes wide and blank, her body limp in his arms. In the dream, he watched his hands wrap around her throat, watched as her breath left her body. When he woke, it was no dream. His hands were cold, his knuckles bruised. And there, lying in the bed next to him, was Liz, her face pale, eyes wide open but lifeless, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Panic surged through Mike. He had no memory of what happened, no idea how he had killed her, but the evidence was undeniable. His wife was dead, and her body lay cold beside him. He had sleepwalked through the murder, his subconscious doing what his waking mind couldn't fathom. "What the fuck did I do?" he muttered, running his hands through his hair, his heart pounding like a drum. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate. His father walked into the room, his face a mask of grim determination. Mike's father had always been a rough man, someone who dealt with problems swiftly, efficiently, no matter how grisly. "Well, son," his father said with a sigh, looking at Liz's body, "looks like you've gone and done it again." "Again?" Mike stammered, his stomach churning. "What do you mean, again?" His father didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Mike by the shoulders and shook him hard. "You've always been this way, always getting yourself into trouble. And who's the one who has to clean up your goddamn mess? Me. Always me. But this?" He gestured to Liz's corpse. "This is some badass fuckery." Mike stood frozen, his mind reeling. His father began dragging Liz's body, stuffing it unceremoniously into the bedroom closet. "Get a grip," his father barked. "You don't want the neighbors sniffing around. You deal with the guilt, and I'll deal with the mess." Days passed, and Mike tried to move on. He tried to convince himself that Liz's death was a horrible accident, a freak occurrence, something he could bury in the darkest corner of his mind. But Liz didn't leave him. It started with little things, the feeling of being watched.
At first I brushed it off. Paranoia, guilt, my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling grew, intensified until I couldn't escape it.
He would be working, and out of the corner of his eye, he'd see movement, a shadow that flickered in the hallway, the silhouette of a figure just outside his line of sight. Her presence was everywhere, suffocating him.
When I opened the closet to grab a shirt, I swore I could see her eyes staring back at me from the darkness.
He shut the door quickly, but the image burned into his mind. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, there she was, Liz, watching him, her cold, lifeless eyes drilling into his soul. Mike spiraled, his grip on reality slipping with each passing day. He started talking to his father, pleading with him to acknowledge Liz's ghost.
"Can't you see her? She's here, she's everywhere!"
Mike would shout, his voice cracking, his eyes wild with fear, but his father would just shake his head.
"You're losing it, Mike. Get a hold of yourself."
One night, Mike snapped again. He was sitting in the living room when he saw her. Liz, standing in the doorway, her head cocked at an unnatural angle, her lips pulled back in that same sick smile.
"I'm still watching you, Mike,"
she whispered, her voice cold, her eyes unblinking. Mike screamed, stumbling backward, knocking over the coffee table. He ran to his father's room, banging on the door.
"She's here! Liz is here! You've got to believe me!"
His father opened the door, his expression irritated.
"I'm tired of this shit. Liz is dead. You need to let it go."
Mike's breath came in ragged gasps.
"She's not gone. She's still watching me. Can't you see her?"
"No, Mike, I can't, and neither can you."
Weeks passed, and Mike's sanity unraveled. The house became a prison, every room haunted by Liz's ghostly presence. He stopped going to work, stopped eating, stopped caring about anything but escaping the constant oppressive feeling of her gaze. The dreams became worse. Every night he relived the moment of her death, the feeling of her throat beneath his hands, the sight of her lifeless body collapsing on the bed. And when he woke, she was there, standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes fixed on him, accusing him without words. Desperate, Mike confronted his father one last time.
"You have to help me. I can't take it anymore. She's always there. She never stops watching."
His father sighed, the weariness of years of cleaning up after his son evident in his eyes.
"I told you, Mike. You have to let it go. She's not here."
But Mike couldn't let it go. He couldn't escape her gaze. And so one night, as the whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him to act, he grabbed the same knife his father had used to cut the ropes off Liz's lifeless hands. He stabbed it into his own chest, over and over again, screaming,
"You won't watch me anymore. You won't!"
As Mike bled out on the cold floor, his father stood over him, shaking his head. The father muttered under his breath gently with an apparent glee in his eyes and a sinister smile on his thin, crooked lip.
"That, my son, is some badass fuckery?"
I didn't plan on buying a corpse, I mean, who would? But that's the sort of thing you tell yourself until you've been sucked in, ensnared by some impulse that doesn't seem like your own. And for me, it all started at that strange late-night auction, hidden in the basements beneath Old Town. The basement was thick with heat, despite the rain hammering down outside. A crowd of faces I didn't recognize loomed in shadows, whispering as they held up numbered paddles. Cracked chandeliers swung overhead, casting flickering lights on objects laid out before us, objects none of us should have been there to buy. Each one came with a backstory, handwritten on brittle parchment, describing curses, hexes, and long histories of misfortune. Each object was said to be possessed, inhabited by something unspeakable. When the corpse was brought out, the room went quiet.
Lot 45, we present the veiled body, a specimen discovered in the 1800s, perfectly preserved, cursed and never buried. The family who kept it, all dead, bidders are warned.
People shifted in their seats, uneasy. I should have left right then, but I didn't. The auctioneer's voice droned on.
Let's start the bid at $100. Do I hear 100?
My hand shot up before I realized what I was doing.
Sold.
That night, I brought the body home. It lay heavy in a long, wood-paneled crate, its face covered with a yellowed linen veil. I didn't dare lift it, though I felt it calling to me somehow.
Are you really going to keep that thing in your house?
My friend Lisa asked when I called her the next day. It's just an old body. Think of it like an artifact, I said, though my words felt flimsy even to me.
An artifact that supposedly killed a family. You've officially lost it, Ben.
But I couldn't shake the feeling of attachment. That night I heard soft rustling in my living room just beyond my bedroom door. When I checked, everything was still, yet a faint smell of rot lingered in the air. 3 days in, the disturbances began in earnest. First, it was my cat, Moxie. She hissed every time she entered the room with the body, her fur standing on end as she stared at it, growling like she'd seen something I couldn't. Then one night she disappeared. No trace of her, just a single paw print in the dust that seemed to trail toward the body and then vanished. And the body itself, it looked different. Was it closer to the edge of the crate? I'd measured it, even taken photos. It should have been exactly where it was before, but I swore it was closer. I shook off the feeling. But by the next morning, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The body's face seemed to have shifted, its features somehow blurring into something more alive. I decided to contact a local historian named Dr. Connolly, a man known for his work with cursed artifacts.
Are you saying it's moving?
He asked, clearly skeptical. Yes, I've documented it, I replied, desperate for validation, and I've followed all the care instructions. It's still wrapped, veiled, but the smell, it's like it's rotting anew. Dr. Connolly was silent for a moment.
There's a legend associated with such artifacts. A veiled corpse can supposedly reflect the living and consume what they love most.
Consume? My stomach tightened.
Blood sacrifices, whispers in the dark. These things feed off attachments, taking on aspects of their owner. If you wish to end this, you need to perform a separation ritual.
I should have been terrified. I should have thrown that corpse out then and there. But something about his words felt like a challenge. The instructions for the ritual were simple enough. I would need 3 items: a mirror, a candle, and a drop of blood.
Only a single drop.
Dr. Connolly had stressed, his voice deadly serious.
This is not a game. Make the cut on your finger, just a touch. Any more, and the link might become irreversible.
I waited until midnight, the room dim except for the flickering candle beside the crate. I pressed the knife to my finger, watching as a single bead of blood blossomed and dropped onto the body's veil. The candle sputtered, casting eerie shadows, and I whispered the words Dr. Connolly had given me. They were old, foreign, alien. The air grew thick, almost choking. Then something whispered back. At first I thought I imagined it. A soft hiss, faint but deliberate, like the scrape of skin on bone. Then I heard it again, unmistakable this time, a breathy, rattling sound from the crate, and the veil shifted, just a little, as if whatever lay beneath it had taken its first breath in centuries. Ben? The voice was mine, unmistakably my own. I stumbled backward, cold sweat prickling my skin. It came again, quieter now, echoing through the room. Ben? I grabbed my phone and dialed Lisa's number, desperate for something to ground me. When she picked up, she didn't even let me speak.
Ben, are you all right? Her voice was tight, almost frantic. I had the worst nightmare about you and...
Her words trailed off as a cold breeze swept through my room. I felt the same tug, a pull toward the crate that seemed stronger than ever.
Lisa, listen to me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I need you to come over. I think I need help.
There was silence on her end, and then she said,
Ben, your voice. It sounds different.
Her words chilled me, and I hung up. Something inside me knew that inviting her over would be a mistake. In the days that followed, I felt the corpse's influence seep deeper into my life. My reflection in the mirror grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, like I hadn't slept in weeks. And the strangest part? Every morning, the body looked a little more alive, mirroring my own face in sickening ways. One morning, I awoke to find clumps of hair scattered across my pillow, and when I looked in the mirror, a matching bald patch was etched on the corpse's scalp, raw and pink like a fresh wound. "What do you want from me?" I shouted one night, desperation clawing at my voice.
I am you, Ben. I'm everything you will become.
I staggered backward, heart pounding as my mind spun. In a flash, I understood. It wasn't just reflecting me, it was replacing me. By the end of the month, I was barely recognizable. Friends and family stopped visiting, their calls unanswered. I couldn't bear to leave the corpse alone, terrified of what it would do in my absence. My body grew weaker, my skin pale and papery, as if the life were being drained from me with every passing day. And each night I'd hear it whisper, taunting me, feeding on my fear. Finally, I reached a breaking point. I didn't care about the consequences. I was getting rid of the corpse once and for all. But when I tried to lift the crate, it wouldn't budge. The wood felt like stone, rooted to the floor as if it had become part of the house itself. In a final act of desperation, I ripped off the veil. What I saw underneath haunts me to this day. The face was mine, my features twisted and rotten, eyes sunken and hollow.
Thank you for bringing me back.
Before I could react, the world spun and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in the crate. I tried to scream, to move, but my body felt stiff as if bound in place by invisible chains. Over me, a new veil was draped, and through the thin fabric, I saw a figure standing over me, my own reflection, alive and well, looking down with a wicked smile.
Thank you, Ben. Now rest.
And then the lid closed, sealing me in darkness. I write this now from somewhere beyond, my voice trapped, unable to scream or be heard. I am nothing but a shadow, a whisper from beneath the veil, trapped in a cage I cannot escape. If you ever see an auction for a cursed body, turn and run. Don't let it lure you in. Don't let it steal what makes you, you. Because once it does, there's no coming back. Just as my mind settled into the quiet, endless dark, a faint scratching sound broke the silence, a rhythm, almost a code. My heart surged with a flicker of hope. Could someone be out there? Desperately, I tried to move my stiff fingers, forcing them against the wood, tapping in return. But then the scratching changed, taking on a pattern that felt familiar.
Ben?
The voice echoed from above, muffled, distorted, but I recognized it. It was Lisa. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat, nothing but a silent rasp. I felt her presence just above me, her voice tense as she spoke in a strange, almost chanting whisper. But then, something twisted in my mind, a memory, long buried, flooding back. I remembered the night I'd called her, desperate, scared. Her voice had sounded different that night. It was then I realized Lisa had known about the curse all along. She'd been the one who told me about the auction, subtly planting the idea, encouraging my curiosity about the unknown. And now, she was here, finishing whatever ritual I'd unknowingly started. Suddenly the scratching stopped, and Lisa's voice came again, soft and chilling.
Goodbye, Ben, or should I say hello?
As her voice faded, a faint glow seeped through the crate, illuminating the corpse's reflection, a shadowy silhouette, shifting to reveal a figure stepping closer. My own twisted face stared back, smirking. Lisa's plan had worked. She'd freed the curse to take me, binding my soul beneath the veil so that the cycle could continue. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more haunting tales from my sick and demented mind. A special shout-out goes to Del Gibson from the Horror Central Facebook group. Thank you for supporting me on my fledgling journey to YouTube stardom. Your encouragement keeps the scares coming, and I couldn't do it without you and all the amazing horror fans who believe in this channel. Stay tuned, and remember, sometimes it's better not to look too closely into the shadows.